Right, it is 1 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to Normalizing Mental Health by Lifting the Stigma of Mental Illness with Scott today. We will run from 1 to 2:30, so just be conscious of the time. I know a couple people had asked the question in the chat box. Everyone is muted, your cameras are disabled. So the only method of communication is going to be that chat box. So please be sure to use that chat box throughout, whether that's asking questions, providing feedback. I know that Scott's going to be doing some polling, so you might need to use that for that. But you are muted, your cameras are disabled. You can also use that Q&A to ask questions also. Please visit our website, icpn.org. You can view all of our upcoming trainings. We do have 2 that are on the website and able to be registered for. So we have July 24th. So next week, we have how to build therapeutic rapport with clients and staff. And then we also have one scheduled for August 13th, which is a little bit abnormal for us because it is on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday. But that one is the forgotten factor sensory processing. We're super excited about that one. We have a consulting occupational therapist who's doing that for us. So those ones are available on the website to register for. We will have an additional one added probably by the end of the week for August also. Please be sure to check those out. You can also join our mailing list if you are not already on that. If you go to our website, icpn.org, click on join mailing list on the top right-hand corner of the page. Continuing education certificates, I know that's a hot topic. They will actually be delivered to you by the end of the week. We do have a new process for that. That's more of an automated process. So be on the lookout. By the end of the week, it will come to the email address that you registered with. If for some reason you do not receive that, then feel free to reach out to me. I will include my email address into the chat box, but it is ddaly@hope.us. Again, it's going to come to the email address that you registered with. At times, sometimes we might mistype something, so there could be some issues, but if you don't receive it, reach out to me. If you're calling into the webinar, you are only accounted for by the phone number that you are calling in from. So I don't have a name that's associated with that. So if that is the case, send me an email after the webinar today with your name, the phone number that you called in from, and I can make sure that you receive your certificate as well. I believe that is everything that I have. Scott, if you want to go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Danielle. I appreciate it very much. And welcome everybody to Normalizing Mental Health by Lifting the Stigma of Mental Illness. I hope everybody's having a great day after the crazy weather we've had. And I'm very happy to be back and doing a webinar here for ICPN. And so let's get started. Maybe. All right. So mental health awareness in the United States. Just as a little bit of context, by the way, I gave this presentation the first time in May, which actually was Mental Health Awareness Month, which made this piece a little bit more relevant, but still very important. Mental Health Awareness Month has actually been recognized in the United States since 1949. The Awareness Month started off as a week-long event first launched by Mental Health America. So it's a happy 75th anniversary in terms of mental health awareness. Mental Health Awareness Week was actually established in the United States in 1990 by NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, to educate and increase awareness about mental illness. So mental health awareness has been around for at least 75 years. So how are we doing with that? So this is the first poll to make this webinar interactive. We are doing a polling section. And so if everybody has access to their phone, if you wouldn't mind pulling up your messages and send a text message to the number 22333. That's where you would put the phone number, right? So you create a new message, put in 22333. And then in the message section, put in Scott Sanders 772. Again, I'm doing this slowly so everybody has time to get this in, and you'll be able to participate in the polls as we go through the presentation. So once again, 22333, Scott Sanders 772. One thing to keep in mind, there is a limit on the number of responses that we can receive through the polling mechanism. So if for some reason your answer isn't shown or doesn't pop up, it may just be that there are so many responses that not all of them were able to be shown. So how are we doing with regards to mental health awareness? So feel free to answer the question with the answers here. How do you feel we are doing addressing mental health awareness and awareness of disabilities? A, we're doing great. We're doing pretty well. Meh, we're doing so-so. Maybe we're slacking a little and I give up. We suck at this. Okay. Looking at mess of self, that, hey, perfectly acceptable. I think that would be where the last webinar was as well, in terms of just kind of in the middle. We're doing okay, but we're not doing the best that we could. Thank you everybody for participating. There'll be more polls as we go on. In fact, here's the second one. So when we're talking about mental health awareness, and we're talking about the things that happen in everyday society with regards to mental health, one of the things that can pop up is how casual mental health terms can be used in everyday language, sometimes very casually and sometimes in somewhat of a derogatory manner. So please let me know if you have done any of these. Have you ever said, oh yeah, don't we all have a little OCD? All right, 81%. All right. No comment. All right, 81%. Yeah, it's a pretty common term that people say, oh, well, that's just a little bit of my OCD, when we tend to be very particular about something, right? What about, especially lately, how many times have you heard the phrase on the spectrum? A lot, a little, not at all. Wait, is that a thing? Wow, a lot. Yes, on the spectrum is one of those terms that I've heard more and more, especially in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. It is a term that has popped up much more casually within conversations. What about ever having a panic attack when you lost something? Right? Oh my God, I had a panic attack when I lost my phone this morning. Phones are a big one for people, right? I don't lose things, and if I did, I wouldn't freak out. Okay, so 85% of you have felt like you had a panic attack when you lost something. Pretty common. What about, have you ever heard someone referred to as psycho, schizo, bipolar, manic, borderline, or a psychopath? 88%. Yeah, that's a high number. And absolutely, it is one of those things you have either probably said in your past or heard someone say in conversation somewhere near you. What about the R word? Nobody likes this one, right? Retarded. Do you ask people to stop using it when you hear it? And does your intervention have an age limit? Have you talked to your kids about it? When I ask about, does your intervention have an age limit? Do you say something only to people over the age of 6 or under the age of 50? I don't know. What is your age? What is your age limit in terms of that? That is probably the best number I've ever seen, 92% saying, yes, I ask people to stop. I've talked to my kids about it. I don't like bigotry. Very, very nice. So why are these things so common? How have all of these words become so casual in our everyday language? When we talk about having a little bit of OCD, for individuals who have obsessive compulsive disorder, that can feel very demeaning and derogatory, because obsessive compulsive disorder is a very real thing that people definitely struggle with, the obsessive thoughts and the compulsions in which they act on them. And so saying that we all have a little OCD can definitely feel demeaning to the person who actually has an obsessive compulsive disorder. Referring to somebody as on the spectrum, again, it is not being used in a supportive, positive manner, but more with regards to a derogatory use of the term. Well, but that person's on the spectrum, meaning they are different in some way. Or even having a panic attack when you lose something. As a person who's experienced a panic attack, I can honestly say when I hear somebody say that, I think, nope, that wasn't anywhere close to a panic attack. So, and the other ones, schizo, psycho, bipolar, these are terms that we've heard for many years and have been used in media and all types of communication throughout much of the last 50 years. So let's get an idea of how perhaps the public may perceive mental health and mental health awareness. Media representations of people with mental illness can influence perceptions and stigmas about mental illness, and they often have been negative, inaccurate, or violent representations. A study published by Scarf back in 2020 looked at a recent example, the popular film Joker, which portrays the lead character as a person with a mental illness who becomes extremely violent. The study found that viewing the film was associated with higher levels of prejudice towards those with mental illness. And additionally, the authors suggest that Joker may actually exacerbate self-stigma for those with a mental illness, leading to delays in seeking out help. That's huge. I actually really liked the movie Joker, but I do remember watching it and at certain times feeling a little disturbed and a little unsettled by the things that were being portrayed. But the one that really sticks out to me was early on in the film where Joaquin Phoenix's character is informed that he will no longer be able to come to therapy, and he begins laughing. And what they were showing was an example of an incongruent affect. So the person's expression of emotion does not match what they were actually feeling. And while as a clinician, I knew what was happening, my first thought was, my gosh, there is going to be thousands, if not millions of people who see this movie who have no idea what just happened or how that comes to be a part of or a symptom of that person's illness. And so I do understand how these things can have the negative impact of stigmatizing mental illness. So then I said, well, what if we started Googling around and seeing what the public is thinking with just regards to movies, about other disabilities, things of that nature. There we go. So, uh, media representation. So the first one that I Googled was autism. So are we doing any better with autism? And when I first Googled movies with representing autism, the first one that popped up was What's Eating Gilbert Grape, which confused me a little bit because I didn't actually remember any reference to autism in that movie. I fully expected Rain Man to be the first movie that popped up. But so I started reading this article about What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and I thought maybe media representations of people with autism can are maybe better. So did a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nominated worthy performance in What's Eating Gilbert Grape bring some positive social attention to autism? Let's see what this writer had to say. Autism is not explicitly mentioned in as such in this film, but most experts agree, and you'll notice that I underlined that with the question mark because there was no reference to any experts or any journal article with which this person had actually researched this information. That Arnie's traits align with those of autism. His repetitive movements, okay, echolalia, all right, self-injurious behavior. That's where my mind got blown, because self-injurious behavior is not a symptom of autism. The use of atypical speech, preference for routine, his childlike nature, again, a very offensive way of thinking about it. Mind blindness, which is a term that I had not known, which I have the asterisk there. Mind blindness is typically defined as the inability to attribute or recognize cognitive or emotional states of others. So that was a learning moment for me. And lack of danger perception, as he has a fondness for climbing the water tower, all indicate that he is on the spectrum. This is also one of the few films where the autist is not portrayed as a savant, so that's a refreshing change. I I was offended by this, and I am just a clinician. And so I thought, man, public perception has not gone well so far. Maybe somebody else is going to give me some hope. What about what if we Google movies about people with intellectual disabilities? And the first one that popped up was actually about Forrest Gump, and I thought, fantastic. So I started reading this article, and then came to a point where I realized it really wasn't as much about Forrest Gump as much as it was an article about people with disabilities. And so the writer says in here, furthermore, the film takes a shot at humanity's own cruelty and distaste for the disabled. During a scene at New Year's, Dan and Forrest are in a hotel room with two women. When Forrest doesn't want to do anything, the women get angry, leaving Dan to defend Gump. In a fit of anger, Dan falls out of his wheelchair, leading to a slew of insults and laughter from the women. At this moment, the audience is meant to be reminded of their own cruelty and how those with disabilities are belittled and pitied. Of course, the movie ends up undoing everything it sought to deconstruct with the finale when Lieutenant Dan arrives at Forrest's wedding with magic legs. The film has to have him find his masculinity and hew his redemption alongside a return to normality, in this case being able-bodied. Ms. Kristen Lopez, the contributing writer on this article, is a disabled writer. She has been disabled throughout her life and is in a wheelchair. And the words that she used really hit hard in terms of, yes, I did realize that as great of a movie as that is, and as wonderful as a moment that is, it is a bit strange that the way to be redeemed and the way to be normal and be masculine again is to be able-bodied and not support the idea that people with disabilities can be masculine and can be normal. So I kept looking a little bit more about Forrest Gump because I thought, man, there's got to be something in here about intellectual disabilities. So then I found this other article and I started reading it and I thought, wow, this is something. So Forrest Gump is an offensive portrayal of a man with an intellectual disability. Now, I've had people tell me Forrest doesn't have a disability. He's just a little slow or simpler than most folks. It's funny because almost every Forrest Gump fan I know is the kind of person who uses the word retarded in a regular way and then says they didn't mean it that way. That's exactly what the filmmakers of Forrest Gump are doing. Zemeckis and company are crafting this man who is literally an idiot. So I don't know if any of you are feeling the same way I did as I was reading this, but I started getting mildly uncomfortable because I thought, man, oh, wow, I don't know what this guy is saying. Like, where is this leading to? So you got to wait for it. They chose to make this character an imbecile. It's plain condescending towards people with intellectual disabilities. I am close friends with children and adults with intellectual disabilities, ranging from severe to incredibly mild. None of them are like Forrest. They dehumanized him. Everything he does is for comedic purposes. I'm not objecting to feel-good movies, but when it's done at the expense of a group of people who sometimes can't speak up for themselves about how they're portrayed in media, then I have a problem. That I can agree with. And by the end of that article, I was absolutely on board. And the thing that made me absolutely take a step back as I was reading this article and then researching where did it come from and everything else, that article had been written less than 2 months before I gave this first presentation. So just 4 months ago. So maybe some people do get it. So what do you think it's about? I mean, we had a pandemic a few years ago, and there was a large acknowledgement that the pandemic had had a significant effect on people's mental health. And so, if mental health awareness has been around for 75 years, why does the stigma surrounding mental illness still occur? Stigma often comes from a lack of understanding or fear. Inaccurate or misleading media representations of mental illness contribute to both of these factors. A review of studies on stigma show that while the public may accept medical or genetic nature of mental health disorders and the need for treatment, many people still have a very negative view of those with mental illness. So no matter how much as a society we say, yes, we recognize that these things are medical or genetic issues, it doesn't help people to accept the idea that people with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities are just people. And there is no reason for a stigma because of a label associated with that person. Because the ultimate outcome of that type of thinking is that the average delay between symptom onset and treatment is 11 years. And in a little bit, we'll talk about why that number is so very important. But now it's time for our third poll. So once again, make sure you have your phone at the ready, text message 22333, and then Scott Sanders 772. So what are some common stigmas associated with people with disabilities and or mental illness? So for this one, I'm going to ask you to type in something. Tell me a little bit, you could write in words. So tell me a little bit about what are some common stigmas associated with people with mental illness. And as you are doing this, the words will begin to appear on the screen. This is one of my favorite things. The words that appear larger means that more people are putting those words in. Violent, work, dangerous, emotions, incapable, unstable, weird, evil, stupid, man. Yep. All of those are words absolutely associated with people with disabilities and or mental illness. Interesting that this presentation's main word was violent. Last presentations was crazy. I just saw that this morning. So interesting how differently people think about things at different times. So thank you all for participating in that. Breaking down the barriers to understand the three types of stigma. The three types of stigma that we are going to look at today are public, self, and structural stigma. Public stigma is the reaction that the general public has to people with disabilities and or mental illness, similar to what we were doing in terms of looking at just how Hollywood has portrayed certain disabilities, mental illness in films and on television. Self-stigma is the prejudice which people themselves have about their own disabilities or mental health. And lastly, it'll be structural stigma, which is a more systemic form of stigma, involves policies of governments and private organizations that intentionally or unintentionally limit opportunities for people with mental illness. Examples include lower funding for mental illness research or fewer mental health services relative to other forms of care. And in terms of the first two components, the public and self-stigma, those two ideas can also be broken down into three components: stereotypes, the prejudice, and discrimination. So obviously stereotypes are negative beliefs about a group or about the person has about themselves in terms of stereotypes. Prejudice is the agreement with belief and or a negative emotional reaction towards a a uh, a population. And discrimination, the behavior response to prejudice. So how do people respond to that discrimination? Do they avoid it? Do they just let it go? Is it a passive, we're just going to let things happen as they are? And then obviously the same with self, negative beliefs about themselves, prejudice about individuals with disabilities and or mental illness, and discrimination that the person experiences as a result of stigma and discrimination. And in terms of how these things kind of work, the stereotypes and prejudices in terms of the public perception, people with mental illness are dangerous, incompetent, to blame for their disorder, or unpredictable. That is how oftentimes the public perception can be perceived in terms of stereotypes and prejudices. That same concept with regards to self, the person may feel that I'm dangerous, incompetent, or to blame for my illness. In terms of the structural stigma, the stereotypes are more embodied in laws and other institutions. With regards to discrimination, employers may not hire individuals with certain mental illnesses or intellectual or developmental disabilities. Landlords may not rent to them. Healthcare system offers lower standards of care for those individuals as well. And so for the person with the mental illness or intellectual or developmental disability, these thoughts may lead to lower self-esteem and self-efficacy. So why try? Someone like me is not worthy or able to get work, live independently, or have a good, healthy life. And in terms of discrimination, in terms of structural stigma, it leads to a number of issues with regards to intended and unintended loss of opportunities, housing, work, all types of discriminatory practices. The impact of stigma ultimately is reduced hope, lower self-esteem, increased psychiatric symptoms, difficulty with social relationships, reduced likelihood of staying in treatment, and increased work difficulties. Stigma has a huge impact on the person with mental illness or intellectual developmental disabilities. Some of the other harmful effects can include reluctance to seek help. The more the person feels bad about what they are experiencing, or maybe shamed for it, or embarrassed, or whatever it might be, it can decrease their want and their interest in seeking out help. And it reduces the likelihood of staying in treatment. One of the most difficult aspects of mental health provisions is ultimately the cycle that is often seen in terms of a person has their symptoms are getting very bad, and so they go to the doctor and they seek out that help, and then everything starts getting a little bit better. And so 6 weeks later, the person then says, well, I'm doing much better. And so I don't have to be on my medications anymore, and puts themselves right back into that same loop, reducing the likelihood of staying in treatment because of the negative stigma associated not only with mental illness and intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, but also with treatment and medications associated with treatment for those diagnoses. Social isolation is a big one. Lack of understanding by family, friends, coworkers, or others. That can be very difficult, especially when we talk about a illness such as schizophrenia, which has a late onset. Fewer opportunities for work, school, or social activities, or trouble finding housing. Bullying, physical violence, and harassment. Health insurance that doesn't adequately cover your mental illness treatment, and belief that you'll never succeed at certain challenges or that you can't improve your life. Stigma can also impact family and friends. The people that are caregivers and taking time to support and encourage this person often provide essential help and support for people with mental illness. They can also experience stigma as well. And those individuals may also internalize stigma and blame themselves for what is happening, or they may fear that people will blame them for causing a loved one's illness or reject the family socially. The stigma can lead to reduced emotional support, social isolation, and reluctance to seek care for their relative or for their loved one. Stigma is also around in diverse communities. Stigma about mental illness is especially an issue in some diverse racial and ethnic communities where it can be a major barrier to people from those cultures in terms of accessing treatment, just because of the social or cultural norms that have been associated with that individual throughout most of their life. And that brings us to our fourth poll. Hope you guys are enjoying these interactive pieces of the presentation. I know I always do. So how many of you feel comfortable discussing your own mental health openly and honestly with your supervisor? I feel comfortable talking about mental health. I do not feel comfortable. Or is it my supervisor is watching me, so I'm going to say yes, or nope, not going to happen, not talking to him whatsoever. 68%, that is fantastic. And here is why. A 2022 poll from the APA found that mental health stigma is still a major challenge in the workplace. About half of workers say that they can discuss mental health openly and honestly with their supervisor, 48%. We were up in over 60, down from 56% in 2021 and 62% in the year of the pandemic. So during the pandemic, people were more apt and felt more comfortable talking with their supervisors about mental health services as well as mental health issues. As time has gone on, and now public perception has somewhat changed about COVID and things of that nature, people feel less comfortable addressing those things with their employers. Half also say they feel comfortable using mental health services with their current employer, compared to 64% and 67% in the 2 years prior to that. Interestingly enough, so our numbers today were over 60% in terms of people feeling comfortable. Fantastic, that's great. The last time we did this presentation, the number was literally 56%, the same number we had in 2021. It's always fascinating to me to see how close we are to that number whenever we do this presentation. And it's important that we think about this in terms of the workplace, because EAP programs, employee assistance programs, are throughout the country, commonly available through employers, and they help employees deal with a variety of concerns such as work-life stress, issues affecting mental and emotional well-being, family issues, financial concerns, relationship problems, legal concerns. But only 3 to 5% of employees in America use available EAP services. 3 to 5%. So even though these services are out there and available, people just aren't using them. So thus far, we have talked about the big three types of stigma: public, self, and structural. But is there a fourth one, an unspoken stigma that we just don't like to talk about? The stigma of mental illness can impact clinicians, medical care, residential placement options, and educational opportunities as well. For clinicians, in terms of a stigma, a clinician may have a clinical bias towards certain diagnoses or populations. So I can remember being in graduate school and professors asking, is there a population with whom you would not be able to work with? And almost every class that I ever participated in, there was a healthy number of people that said I would not be able to be a drug and alcohol counselor. And that one always stuck out to me, because oftentimes those individuals had some life event occur where they did not feel comfortable addressing that as a clinician. And so those biases come into play when we get into this profession. In terms of clinicians, we also may have unfamiliarity with symptoms associated with particular diagnoses. As a behavior analyst, we are generally trained to look at only observable, measurable behavior. But there are also aspects of mental illness and intellectual disabilities that are not observable, measurable behavior in terms of what we would generally see as, say, data collection. And so if we're not familiar with a change in somebody's mental status from depression to mania, and we are just tracking it as behavioral data of, I don't know, the number of times Bobby goes to the restroom, then we're not going to capture the change in the mental health status for that individual. And lastly, treating mental illness with behavioral interventions. Again, if a person is unfamiliar with what the person is experiencing and struggling with in terms of their mental illness or intellectual developmental disabilities, and we're treating things that may have a medical or psychiatric cause with behavioral interventions, and we're sitting back wondering why it's not working, it's because we're not actually addressing the problem. In terms of medical care, hospitals may also be unwilling or unable to provide inpatient care for individuals due to particular diagnoses, such as a personality disorder or an intellectual disability, or a high frequency of ER visits, or even doctor's appointments. Individuals who are quote unquote frequent flyers are people who are well known to many hospitals and are individuals who have a tougher time receiving treatment when they go to the ER or are setting up doctor's appointments, things of that nature. Also, in terms of medical care, due to sensory issues, anxiety, trauma, some individuals may require anesthesia or sedation for routine procedures, but are unable to find treatment due to insurance or medical provider complications. Many individuals are unable or unwilling to, or unable to find dental care or medical care that their loved one can receive because they may require sedation, things of that nature. And even in terms of residential placement, community integrated living arrangement opportunities may be significantly limited for individuals with diagnoses that are stigmatized by a number, sorry, I'm unable to see the last words, by association with aggression, self-injury, or complex trauma histories, such as an intermittent explosive disorder, personality disorders, things of that nature. Go. So in terms of discrimination, the stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness can be subtle or obvious. But no matter the magnitude, they all lead to harm. Discrimination always leads to harm for any of the individuals that we serve. People with intellectual disabilities and mental illness are marginalized and discriminated against in various ways. But understanding what that looks like and how to address it and eradicate it can help us to address those things. Stigma even becomes more problematic for individuals with multiple complex needs already pushed to the margins of their communities. Society is particularly cruel to those with personality disorders, homelessness, addiction, and criminal convictions, all of which can tend to happen if a person's mental health is not well managed. Mental health problems act as a barrier to accessing housing, and homelessness can have a significant impact on a person's mental health. So if a person doesn't have stable living, that can have a significant impact on their mental health. Meanwhile, homeless individuals have trouble accessing primary care and addiction services due to discrimination. And not only discrimination, but also oftentimes those type of services have to be tied to a permanent address. And if you're homeless, how do you have a permanent address? Discrimination is also a health crisis. Mental health stigma is not only an interpersonal issue, it's a health crisis in this country as around the world. Individuals with serious mental illness die decades earlier than they should, not by increased suicides or injuries, but actually by poor physical health. And some of this disparity results from side effects of medications, but it's also having to do with lifestyle factors such as smoking, lack of exercise, and inadequate diet. Inaccessible healthcare services, um, I'm sorry. However, inaccessible healthcare services, diagnostic overshadowing, whereby healthcare professionals attribute physical complaints to pre-existing mental illness, and indeed prejudice from individual practitioners all have an effect. From cancer screening to diabetic hospital admissions to hypertension, hypertension management, the physical health care that people with mental illness receive is appallingly poor in comparison to what should be offered or what is offered for people with similar and perhaps less taxing diagnoses and conditions. I hope some people are oohing and ahhing at these transitions. I worked hard on them, just so you know. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about stigma and we've talked a little bit about the impact that stigma has and discrimination and all of these things, what about putting it into perspective for us? It may help to put the prevalence rates of people with disabilities and or mental illness into perspective so that we can at least make it make sense. Approximately 6.5 million people in the United States have an intellectual disability. Approximately 1 to 3% of the global population has an intellectual disability, as many as 200 million people. So again, do the math. 200 million versus 6.5, that would suggest 193.5 million people outside of the United States have an intellectual disability. That's a fair number. 1 in 5 adults in the United States experience mental illness each year. 1 in 5, so about 20%. Apologize for my light continuing to go out. So 1 in 5, 20%. 46% of Americans will meet criteria for a diagnosable. Sorry. I still think that one is important, so we're going to go back to that one. 46% of Americans will meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition sometime in their life. 46%. That's also almost half of all Americans will meet the criteria for diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their life. And that does not even suggest that many of those people will seek treatment. I don't have that number, but I could only imagine that it is only about half of those people that probably seek treatment at any given time. There we go. Now it moves. 1 in 20 US adults experience serious mental illness each year. So again, think about that in terms of the last numbers. 1 in 5 people experience a mental illness at some point during any given year. 1 in 20 experience a serious mental illness, meaning that it is having a significant impact on that person's day-to-day living and interactions in their environment. 1 in 6 youth, United States youth, age 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. As a parent of 2 children in that age range, that's a pretty scary number. 1 in 6 is a pretty high number. 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. So that would suggest that people are not just born with this or expressing symptoms at a very, very young age. Many forms of mental illness pop up later in teenage years or by young adulthood. And so oftentimes some of the stigma and misunderstanding about mental illness simply comes from the change in the person. For example, if a 14-year-old suddenly begins showing signs of anxiety and never had before, their family members may wonder, where is this coming from? And is there something going on with the person, rather than recognizing that the person may be experiencing an anxiety, social anxiety, or anxiety for the first time in their life. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 14. That number shocked me. Second leading cause of death for children aged 10 to 14. And according to the World Health Organization, mental health disorders account for several of the top causes of disability in established market economies, such as the US. These include major depression, also known as clinical depression, manic depression, schizophrenia, and obsessive compulsive disorder. The World Health Organization recognizes that these not only are causes of disability in established markets, but that they are having a significant impact on societies across the globe. And many people suffer from more than one mental illness at any given time. In particular, depressive illnesses tend to co-occur with substance use and anxiety disorders. Yep. Sorry. No, there we go. All right. So let's talk about a more specific one. We've given general prevalence rates. What about depression? That's a fairly common one that people are aware of. Approximately 9.5% of Americans, adults 18 and over, will suffer from depressive illness each year. 9.5% of the United States population. Women are nearly twice as likely to suffer from major depression than men. However, men and women are equally likely to develop bipolar disorder. So there's that gender equality. While major depression can develop at any age, the average age of onset is mid-20s. And again, people would often think, oh, maybe it would happen a little bit earlier in life. Well, no, the average onset is mid-20s. Again, many people have gotten past high school and college and are starting into their lives and then begin showing signs of depression. That is something that we as a society need to pick up on. And with bipolar disorder, which affects approximately 2.6 of Americans age 18 and older in any given year, the average onset for a first manic episode is during their early 20s. And so again, I want to just look at the numbers for a moment. Bipolar is a phrase and a disorder that has been really commonly thrown around in the last 20 years or so. And probably I've seen it not necessarily diagnosed more, but I've seen the diagnosis more. And yet bipolar disorder is about 2.6% of the American population, and 9.5 have the depressive disorder. So there's about a 7% difference there with regards to bipolar versus other depressive disorders. And so oftentimes we think of a bipolar disorder as the most common, but in reality, it may not be. What about anxiety? Anxiety and depression are usually the two quickest ones for people to be able to respond to or be able to come to mind if you ask somebody about what are some psychiatric diagnoses. Well, approximately 18% of people ages 18 to 54 in any given year have an anxiety disorder. And yes, I see my typo right there. Anxiety disorders include panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, which is the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorder, and phobias, social phobia, agoraphobia, all that specific phobia stuff. 18% have an anxiety disorder. So we were at 9.5 for depression, 18% for anxiety. Panic disorder typically develops late in adolescence or early adulthood. So a person with a panic disorder experiencing panic attacks, that doesn't happen right at 12 years old. It may happen later in adolescence or early into adulthood. First symptoms of OCD often begin during childhood or adolescence, so you may be able to pick up on some of the traits of OCD early if you know what you're looking for. A generalized anxiety disorder can begin at any time, though the risk is highest between childhood and middle age. Individuals with OCD frequently can have problems with substance use or depression, or eating disorders as well. Again, these things are co-occurring disorders. And social phobia begins usually in childhood or adolescence. That one absolutely is one you can see kind of early. Intellectual developmental disabilities refer to neurodevelopmental conditions that affect functioning in two main areas: cognitive functioning, such as learning, problem solving, and judgment, as well as adaptive functioning, activities of daily life such as communication skills and social participation. Additionally, intellectual and adaptive deficits begin early in the developmental period, typically before the age of 18 for diagnosis. Intellectual disability affects about 1% of the population. And of those, 85% have a mild intellectual disability. I'm going to repeat that one more time. Intellectual disability affects 1% of the population, and of those, 85% have a mild intellectual disability. So most of, or many of the people who have a mild intellectual disability may be able to participate in their lives and interact with their environment in a completely productive manner, despite having a stigma or about their intellectual or developmental disability. And as we talked about earlier, 6.5 million people in the United States have an intellectual disability, and 200 million worldwide. So how does that factor in with mental illness? An intellectual disability or developmental disability MI diagnosis, a dual diagnosis, refers to individuals with an intellectual disability who concurrently experience a mental health condition on top. And while the exact prevalence rates are unknown, most professionals accept that roughly 35% of people with intellectual disabilities also experience a mental health challenge, be it anxiety, depression, or whatever it may be that the person may struggle with. But 35% is still a pretty high number in terms of the co-occurrence or comorbidity of diagnoses. So let's talk a little bit about schizophrenia, right? It is a fairly well-known mental illness in terms of often there's misunderstandings about it, or people have their own perceptions about schizophrenia. The good news is schizophrenia only affects about 1% of Americans at any given time. And in most cases, schizophrenia first appears in men during their late teens or early 20s. Again, for you ladies, this happens more often than men. In women, schizophrenia often first appears in their 20s or early 30s. So guys, we get a little bit earlier. Ladies, you get to hold off for a little bit in terms of the first onset. In terms of schizophrenia, that is, again, one of those diagnoses that can be kind of a loaded diagnosis for many individuals and can be very difficult for people to understand and accept. If you think about it, again, the late teens or early 20s. So if you have a loved one, if your son, daughter, your niece or nephew were you got to watch them grow up. And somewhere around 18 years old, this person began making bizarre statements or seeing things that weren't there, talking about hearing voices, things of that nature. That would seem strange for many family members and friends who have known this person for many years, and they may dissociate from that person, or they may think something's going on. And so that strange change for that person may cause that stigma or a discrimination against that person, because in the loved ones' heads, that person's always been this way. How did this thing change? Right? And interestingly enough, I didn't put it in here, but research suggests that the symptoms, more severe symptoms of schizophrenia, tend to subside a little bit after the age of 40. So if you think about it, if schizophrenia pops up late teens, early 20s for guys, early 20s or 30s for ladies, and starts to subside a little after 40, it's about 20 years that people really, really are struggling with the most serious portions of their schizophrenia diagnosis. And in terms of suicide and mental health, which is a topic that comes up quite often, most people who commit suicide have a diagnosable mental disorder, most commonly a depressive disorder or a substance abuse disorder. 4 times as many men than women commit suicide. However, women attempt suicide more often than men. The highest suicide rates in the US are found in Caucasian men over the age of 85, a number that I found extremely shocking. However, suicide is also one of the leading causes of death in adolescents and adults aged 15 to 24. So, second leading cause of death for kids 10 to 17, I believe. It is one of the leading causes of death 15 to 24. And the highest suicide rates are in Caucasian men over the age of 85. Probably not what you were thinking in terms of some of those prevalence rates. Oop. All right, so I bring up all those numbers and all that wonderful stuff because to normalize mental health and mental illness, we have to think about it a little bit differently. And so one thing that I have tried to encourage in staff and people that I've worked with over the years is to think about a time in your life when mental health or mental illness makes sense. Because don't we all experience mental illness at some point in our lives? Absolutely. Yeah. What about grief? Grief is a tough one, right? Loved one passes away, your mother, father, grandma, grandpa, someone very close to you. First feeling, emotion that people tend to experience is sadness, may be referred to as depression. Person becomes more withdrawn, may spend more time laying in bed, or at least not going out in public, not going out with friends, not hanging out with people. Person may be more emotional. I know when my mother passed a few years ago, I couldn't get all the way through a Hallmark commercial without bawling my eyes out. Grief has that effect on people. It also increases our time with family and friends and more time spent reflecting on the life of the person or the life with the person. And so what happens during grief is specific chemicals that are affected include dopamine and serotonin, which affect pleasure and emotion regulation. When you are grieving, these chemicals may not be producing at the same normal levels, causing you to feel more depressed and lack pleasure. So we talked about it earlier in terms of um, in terms of that the general public acknowledges that mental illness may be influenced by medical or physiological causes. And so, again, grief is one of those things that everyone will tend to experience at some point in their life. And so if you've ever experienced it, then you can think about those different stages of that and what that felt like, and recognize that what happened was this life event occurred and your brain's neurotransmitter activity changed, even if it was temporarily for a couple of weeks, and then had to go back to normal. And many individuals with a mental illness experience a similar thing. Symptoms may get worse, person seeks out treatment, and the person symptoms hopefully subside after a period of time. So how can we normalize mental health? Well, let's start with the basics. If most every single person experiences and is able to respond to this life event in a similar way, how have we not developed more compassion, empathy, understanding, acceptance, or normalization of disabilities, mental health, and mental illness? One of the things that we can do to help normalize mental health is to continue psychoeducation about mental health and the signs of symptoms of mental health changes. Should it be taught in high school or in junior high, alongside health class? Again, these are things that once they're introduced to the general public in a much more neutral or a way where people are educated that these things are not negative, are not people are not violent, things of that nature, perhaps with education, more understanding. Stigma and discrimination comes from a lack of understanding. So how can we help educate? We also need to get involved. NAMI, National Alliance on Developmental Disabilities, Special Olympics, Autism Speaks. There's tons of organizations out there. Find the one that speaks to you. And in order to change the stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminatory practices that occur, we also have to change some of the misconceptions about disabilities and mental illness in general. Which brings us to the next one. I know you all have been sitting for a little while, so we have another time for a poll. So what are some common misconceptions about people with disabilities and mental illness? Type me out an answer. One word, a little bit of a sentence. Let me know what you think. Common misconceptions about people with disabilities and mental illness. This is one of my favorite ones. I love seeing all the words pop up. Dumb, unable, non-functional, helpless, violent, weak, failure, stupid, incapable, unpredictable. Absolutely. Thank you all for your input. Absolutely. Those are frequent misconceptions you have probably heard, experienced, or seen at some point in your life. Absolutely. So let's talk about changing some of those. The first one, which obviously is relevant for today's webinar, is violent, that people with mental illness or intellectual developmental disabilities are violent people. This common stereotype is vastly exaggerated by the media. In fact, some mental disorders do have aggression and violence as a possible symptom. Research has shown that using alcohol and drugs is a much more reliable predictor of violent behavior than is a mental disorder. So we can have beer commercials on television, but talking about mental illness is taboo. It is only when a mentally ill person abuses alcohol and illegal drugs that they are somewhat more likely than a non-mentally ill person to be more violent or to be violent. By any measure, however, the vast majority of violent acts are committed by people without a mental disorder. According to the data, only 3% of people with mental illness are violent. 97% are not. Another myth is that intellectual disabilities or aspects of mental illness are comical, right? The media sometimes depicts the experience of mental illness as being comical. And this is a disrespectful thing to do. This is disrespectful of the agony that those individuals experience in those circumstances and can absolutely be harmful to them. Another myth is that it's not curable or there's a poor outcome. If the person has an intellectual or developmental disability, or if they have a mental illness, that's it. Game over. As many as 80% of people suffering from mental illness can effectively return to normal, productive lives if they receive appropriate treatment. Many others can have their suffering significantly reduced as well. Oh, this one's a good one. Common misconception that people with intellectual disabilities or mental illness are morally deficient. It's God's judgment for sinful behavior. And while this was probably, you know, top of the line thinking back in the 18th century, it has no place in today's world. What about the idea that mental illness may be catchable, right? It's like somebody sneezes and the next thing you know, you have an anxiety disorder. You don't develop a mental disorder by being around someone with intellectual disability or mental illness. And some people don't believe in mental disorders. The fact that these disorders respond to clinical treatment and that they can be devastating to a person's life absolutely show that these things are not being faked. Are there instances out there of people feigning a mental illness? Absolutely, but it is not the norm. Mental illness is evidence of a character flaw or that you're weak if you need to seek help. Unfortunately, this stereotype often keeps people from seeking the help that they need. Mental illness is a result of poor parenting. Well, there's a lot of factors that influence a person having mental illness. And it is caused by a variety of inherited and environmental factors. Abusive parenting can contribute, but at the same time, good parenting doesn't necessarily shield a person from having a mental illness either. Since many causative factors are not necessarily in the power of the parent to affect. The last one here is people with mental disorders have nothing to contribute to society. And this is just absolutely untrue. Most of the creative artists, poets, and writers have lived with some sort of mental disorder. Since 20% of the population develop a mental disorder every year, clearly there are millions of Americans who are able to contribute to society on a daily basis while still experiencing a mental health condition. So how are the kids getting their info? Right? Kids are out there trying to get this information. Teens are actually searching for health information online, and mental health issues are among some of the top searches for people in those teenage years. About 4 in 10 teens said that they have looked for people with similar health concerns. So in some ways, it has been okay in the last 20 years as celebrities have come out and been more open about discussing mental health struggles as well as treatment and recovery. People like Demi Lovato or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Michael Phelps, Lady Gaga, all of these individuals have publicly shared their stories of mental health challenges and brought the discussion much more into the general media and everyday conversation. And so young people are really looking for the information for these personal stories online. So again, even if the psychoeducation is people coming out and just telling their truth in terms of what they've experienced, that is important, but we have to get that psychoeducation out there. Well, maybe the news gets better if we look at how our medical field views treatment strategies for physical illness and mental illness, right? Because physical illness refers to a state of poor health. When we get sick, it's a state of poor health or disease that affects the body's functioning and can be observed and diagnosed based on physical symptoms. It is a condition that impacts the overall well-being and functioning of an individual's body. Another way of putting that is an abnormal or physiological unbalanced state of body. Illness, malady, sickness, unwellness, impairment of normal physiological function affecting part or all of the organism. Mental illness are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, or a combination of all of them. They can be associated with distress and or problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. Okay, we're not too far off, are we? Well, let's see how these things are treated. In terms of physical illness, an important aspect of medical model is that it regards signs and symptoms as indicative of an underlying physical abnormality, a pathology within the individual. So physical illness is treated by observing the signs and symptoms of the illness within the person and treating the underlying pathology. All right, so yeah, we look at the person, observe signs and symptoms. We have a pretty regimented idea of what is going on, and we then treat the underlying pathology. So what do we do with mental illness? Well, the biomedical model posits that mental disorders are brain diseases and emphasizes pharmacological treatment to target presumed biological abnormalities. Biologically focused approach to science and policy and practice has dominated the American healthcare system for more than 3 decades. So mental illness is treated by observing the impact that the illness has caused to the person and their environment, and treating the assumed biological abnormalities based on subjective reporting. Subjective reporting based upon the person's possible lack of insight into what's going on in their own mental health status change, and reporting of others who may be unable to provide accurate clinical information in the form of signs and symptoms. So it really looks like from treating physical illness, you look at the person, you look at those signs and symptoms, and you treat the person. But with mental illness, it appears that we are kind of retroactively treating the person just by the definition. Here we go. Mental illness is treated by observing the impact that the illness has caused to the person and their environment, and treating the assumed biological abnormalities based on subjective reporting. So mental illness is treated by observing the impact. So we're already behind the 8 ball, right? The things have already happened. The person is already experiencing the worst part of their symptoms. The signs were already there. We already passed all of that up. The person's entire physiology, their environment, their work life, their relationships, all of those things have to be impacted before we can say, okay, now we have to treat this person due to their mental illness. So while physical illness, we can see it and treat it right then, mental illness is often treated more retroactively. And the impact of how mental illness is treated is that the average delay between symptom onset and treatment is 11 years. So again, let's just do the math. So if the average onset of, let's just say, schizophrenia for a young man is late teens, let's say 18. That would suggest that the person first experiences the symptoms of schizophrenia at 18 years old. This would suggest that that person will not seek treatment until they are 29 years old. In females, if a 24-year-old young lady begins experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia, that would suggest she might be 35 years old before she seeks treatment. Name me one other medical condition that human beings are willing to wait 11 years to seek treatment. Is it possible to address some of the stigmas associated with intellectual disabilities and mental illness by re-examining how we can measure and discuss mental health with our doctor? In addition, wouldn't a more comprehensive whole person approach make much more sense? In order to address these things and how mental illness is treated, a similar system of signs and symptoms associated with changes in mental health should be developed to assist medical professionals. The problem is there's no easy way to do that. This information is important not only for clinicians, but also for the dissemination to the general public to help us normalize observing and supporting mental health as a society. So what if What if there were objective indicators that could help provide signs of mental illness to our doctors? Are there objective indicators, something that we can see, a measurable, observable thing? Well, we do have lab work that, blood work, things of that nature that can tell us a little bit of information, CAT scans. Even changes in neurotransmitter activity can be observed in some form or fashion. Personal caregiver observations as well, increased activity level, decreased sleeping, noticeable changes in mood. Our loved ones, our caregivers, able to describe those things accurately. In terms of the public, noticeable changes in the frequency of impulsive behaviors, increase in risk-taking behavior, suicidal threats or attempts. All of those things could be easily seen as signs or symptoms or tracked in some way. And even in terms of legal issues, law enforcement involvement, legal litigation, orders of protection, are those measures that we could look at as signs and symptoms? I don't know. What if we were able to identify symptoms that may also indicate a change in mental status? Increased aggression, self-injury, property destruction, elopement. These are things behavior analysts work with on a daily basis. Increased impulsivity. How do we measure that though? Including the verbal behavior. And what I mean by that is a person who typically may be more reserved or less talkative with somebody who suddenly is now soliciting others for romantic relationships may suggest that the person has a mental health status change in terms of impulsivity or hypersexuality. No idea. So elevated or depressed mood, but how can we measure those things? Racing thoughts, again, a difficult one to measure unless people have that insight and are able to describe this is what is happening to me. Or subjective reporting of frequency, intensity, duration of behavioral episodes. So what are some of the common signs and symptoms? Diagnosing mental illness is not a straightforward science. It's not as easy. Believe me, I researched for weeks trying to figure this thing out, and the simple answer is there is no simple answer. We can't test for mental illness or intellectual disabilities. Well, mental illness, the same that we test blood sugar levels for diabetes. Each condition has its own set of unique symptoms. Those symptoms often do overlap. So is it more about figuring out how to measure or describe those symptoms across different diagnoses? So common signs and symptoms include feeling sad or withdrawn for more than 2 weeks. Is that a depressive symptom? Trying to harm themselves or end one's life, suicidal ideation, severe out of control risk-taking behavior that causes harm to themselves or other people. Is that impulsivity? Sudden overwhelming fear for no reason, panic attacks, significant weight loss or gain associated with depression or anxiety. People with both depression and anxiety can have either end of the spectrum. Seeing or hearing or believing things that aren't real, hallucinations and delusions. Excessive use of alcohol or drugs, drastic changes, intense worries. Again, all of these things that we talk about do have a clinical name. So is it about educating people about what these things are? So how can you get some symptom information quickly? I provided a list of 10 questions here that are things that I've used in the past with staff members who may not understand what the person they are working with is struggling with. And so I try to have more open-ended questions, or at least a question that the person may be easily able to answer. Is the person more emotional, crying or upset, or sad more? Does the person sound hopeless, appears to be giving their belongings away, or making statements that may suggest they're suicidal? Is the person talking more often and faster than they used to? When the person is talking, what are they talking about? Are the questions or statements coming from the person hard to understand or don't make sense? Is the person moving around faster or jumping from topic to topic to topic? Is the person spending more time in their room? Again, if you get the PowerPoint slides, feel free to, adapt these to your own settings and your own staff in terms of how to get some of this clinical information as quickly as possible. What can we do? In terms of normalizing mental health, it starts with us. We have to understand how the mind and body work together. We have to understand what our personal and professional values are regarding people with disabilities and or mental illness. Everything we've talked about today in terms of changing, normalizing mental health, it starts with us, not only as clinicians, but as people, just in general. It's not just when you're at work, it's all the time. We have to understand how that mind and body works in terms of the relationship that thoughts and verbal behavior has on our emotions, on our day-to-day interactions with our environment, and how we see ourselves and how we want to move forward. As clinicians and as people working with people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness, I encourage you to truly think about what your personal and professional values are regarding people with disabilities and mental illness. And reevaluate those things. Are there areas where you may feel a certain bias? And is there something that you can do to educate yourself or do something to make yourself feel more comfortable working with a particular population? We also have to think about acceptance and acceptance just in general with regards to disabilities and mental illness. Oftentimes, people have a reaction in some way, and acceptance is really about making room for those uncomfortable feelings. And there are times where working with people with, especially severe or profound individuals with intellectual disabilities or people with very severe forms of mental illness, it can be very difficult to manage your own emotions or do the caregiving aspect. And so sometimes that causes resentment or frustration. And it's really about making acceptance for those difficult things because it's a necessary thing that is absolutely important to those people who you are providing those services to. Starts with us in terms of committed actions too, even when it's tough. Somebody starts using that R word around you, absolutely shut that person down. You know, think about what your values are and what are the committed actions that you can do. Is it something about joining a group or advocating, writing a letter to your senator, whatever it might be, even though it may be tough? Have the conversation and try to normalize mental health amongst your family, friends, just in general. Even with regards to social media is a big one, sharing those things, which we'll talk about as well. And diffusion as a means of normalizing as well. If you are thinking about something and having to diffuse something somebody said or something that you, an experience that you had as a clinician or working with somebody, diffusion can be a big one in terms of helping us normalize the experiences that we have. So what can we do? Here is another page. Again, this was one that I brought straight from NAMI's website. You guys can read it on the PowerPoint slides in terms of how we can have the conversation with people. I've also offered some conversation tips, things you can say, such as, thanks for opening up to me. Is there anything I can do to help? Things you should probably avoid saying, like Scott's presentation was awful, or it could be worse, just deal with it, snap out of it. And in terms of what can we do, the last thing that I want to leave you with is links to ICPN, NAMI, National Institute of Mental Health, Stigma, National Alliance on Developmental Disabilities and Psychiatry.org. All of the information that I got in this presentation, I got from these websites. I put them out here because in doing this presentation, in starting it, I was shocked to find the amount of advocacy that is already out there trying to normalize mental health, and it made me very happy. So I would encourage you to do the same and get out there and let's make a difference. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Scott, for your wonderful presentation. There were a couple questions
Yeah,
in the Q&A. I don't know if you want to take a look at that, or I'm happy to read those to you, but we had a couple questions throughout.
sure.
Um,
I'll
so
check
one
those.
of them being Lindsay asks, how does the presence of social media change our acceptance and understanding of intellectual disabilities and mental illness?
I would say that the presence of social media has probably allowed us to have more access to these things. I mean, as especially like young people are getting on social media and learning about some celebrity who has a bipolar disorder or something like that, it it has absolutely increased the awareness about it, but not necessarily changed the public perception. Is the interesting piece. I think perhaps individually people may be more accepting, but as a whole, as a society, perhaps not.
And then Donna talks about how there are, many people that come to the US from cultures where disabilities are, have a shaming stigma to them. And the families may not seek services or whatever. So is there something being done to learn about this among the various cultures and come up with a way to help create an acceptable way to get help rather than people not getting services?
That's a really interesting and good question. And as sad as it is to say, in all of my research, I was unable to find that being addressed. I agree that that is a major issue in terms of how do we help people that may be coming from a different culture, coming from a whole different way of thinking about things, and how do we respect those cultures and values and at the same time educate people. And for the most part, I think people, if you look at the research, people have just said, well, there's cultural differences and we're going to let people decide amongst themselves.
Someone had asked about the genetics of schizophrenia. I don't know if you have an understanding of that, but if it's down to children.
Yes, there is a strong hereditary component to schizophrenia. I don't remember the exact numbers, but uh, there is a strong hereditary component.
And then the last question that we'll address, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is do you think that the public perception of mental illness makes it difficult for people to really understand it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that the public's perception and how casually people throw out some of those things that we talked about earlier, like saying, oh my God, that guy's on the spectrum, or oh, I mean, that guy's bipolar, all of those things absolutely makes it difficult for people to really understand it and accept it for themselves. Imagine, being in high school and, saying, oh, this guy's bipolar or something along those lines. And then a year later, a doctor gives you that diagnosis. Um, that person may or may not accept that they have it. They may research it, and it may, especially if the stigma has already been put there, that that person may have a tough time acknowledging that they are experiencing these symptoms and that they have it, and to understand it as well. Absolutely.
All right. There was a lot of chatter in the chat box as we went through. It's such a great topic to actually discuss. And so we thank you so much for being with us today, Scott, and for presenting. People are really looking forward to this recording coming out. They're very thankful to have your presentation, printed out so that they have access to that knowledge. And I love that you provided those links. That's great. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Scott, so much again. Always do a wonderful job for us. As a reminder, certificates will come to you via the email address that you registered with. If you have any issues, reach out to me. But everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great one.